Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Brad Wilcox, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia, and also the director of the National Marriage Project there. The author of a bunch of books. Most recent book is called Get Married in the Imperative, right? You need like an exclamation point after that. Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. That's a big agenda. But you also have a couple other books. One is called Soulmates, which is about sex, love, and marriage among African Americans and Latinos, and another one called, Soft Patriarchs, which is about Christianity and masculinity, I think. Welcome, Brad.
Great to be here with you today, Greg.
Well, like I said, this book has a very ambitious agenda, saying that basically the future of civilization depends in part on us rescuing this critical institution, which we call marriage. And, you know, I think at the end of the book, when you're thanking all of the people who helped you to write this book, you pointed out that all the way back to Aristotle, right, we've known that people are social creatures. And yet, it seems like regardless of what side of the political debate you're on in the 21st century, we've all embraced a very individualistic approach to understanding people, right? I mean, and, you know, as an economist, this comes naturally, right? You know, the economists always start with Robinson Crusoe on the desert island, and then you kind of work up from there. But I think, you know, you're pointing out that marriage is a profoundly, I guess, natural institution if we believe in something like human nature, and it goes back a long, long time. And in a way, we fail to appreciate how central it is to our existence. And you show an awful lot of empirical data demonstrating correlations, and we've got to dig into the causal relationship, but there's a lot of correlations between marital status and happiness, marital status and prosperity, and all sorts of other good things, including good outcomes for the children that are raised in a family that has a stable marriage. So I guess the first question is, you know, how did we get to this point where marriage is something that's considered sort of, I don't know, optional, provisional, and maybe even harmful to the well-being of individuals?
Yeah, these are great questions, Greg. So I think that the kind of, as I said both in the book and then a piece in the Atlantic, kind of there's a way in which, you know, many elites who would be, I think, probably listening to your podcast, or colleagues of yours at Berkeley, for instance, tend to often, I think, talk left about marriage and family in public, and then tend to walk more right when it comes to their own private lives. And, you know, we were just talking about how a lot of your colleagues at 5 o'clock will, you know, buzz home to, you know, plug in with the kids, help with dinner, you know, whatever else it might be, take their kids to, you know, swim practice or piano lessons and all that stuff. You know, so there's this sort of weird, I think, dynamic where a lot of elites are kind of living marriage and family-centered lives in their own personal lives, and yet then in public, when it comes to sort of talking about marriage, either will publicly, you know, discount marriage, as with many of my colleagues in sociology, or privately they're just not going to talk about it because they think it's not wise. Well, why is that, is the question I think in some ways you're getting at. And I think that is because there's a kind of underlying progressive assumption that guides a lot of our public thinking and talk about marriage, which assumes that kind of every new family form that kind of comes down the road, every kind of relationship innovation that comes down the pike, needs to be celebrated, to be baptized as sort of right and holy. And I think the most recent example of that, of course, is polyamory. And yet, when you actually look at the science, what you generally find, we can argue about causality, and that's a good question you've raised already, but what you find is, at least when it comes to the associations, there's just no question that both kids and adults and communities actually are more likely to be flourishing when strong and stable and monogamous marriages ground and guide the lives of kids, adults, and communities. And so that's the sort of weird dynamic we're sort of living in, where kind of the progressive cultural currents kind of pushing us away from acknowledging or celebrating marriage, and a more family-centered lifestyle oftentimes, And yet the underlying sociological, economic, and psychological realities point us to generally towards the value of monogamous marriage as an anchor for family life and for community life as well.
Well, I mean, is it sort of a fear of normativity, right? I mean, people want to be tolerant. You want to
yes,
certainly not be, too judgmental of people who deviate from this norm. I mean, by pointing out these correlations, are you being normative, and is that a problem? Right?
Sure. So I think part of the challenge here is that we live in a kind of Christian haunted society where there is an understandable and kind of valuable desire on the part of all of us, I think, or many of us, to sort of reach out to the most vulnerable, to sort of the lost sheep in one way or another, right? And that's translated in this domain as kind of like a desire not to make people who are single mothers, for instance, or kids raised by single mothers, for instance, kind of feel in any way stigmatized or out of step with the broader society. And yet at the same time, I think we have to recognize that generally speaking, we're more likely to flourish when we have lots of kids being raised by stably married parents. And so, yes, we can be charitable, we can be, tolerant of deviations, but we should still, I think, do more to celebrate the norm. And I would argue that there's a lot of social science that would lead us to conclude that people who are kind of embracing that norm are more likely to be flourishing in their kids as well.
Well, I think you started the book by talking about your undergraduates that you teach at UVA. And even though the elites do tend to lead married lives when they get older, they don't seem to prioritize that, right? Certainly in their 20s. And I guess this is this idea of capstone marriage versus cornerstone marriage, right? How did we get to that point where, I know a lot of people, I've had a lot of mentors and professors, older ones, who would get married in college, get married in grad school, and their partners would kind of, help them to navigate their career trajectories and so forth. And I think now we have this notion that the spouse is kind of the cherry on top, like it's only after you've made partner at a law firm. It's like, okay, now I could get married. Why do we think that marriage is going to kind of slow us down or impair or impede our success, as opposed to help us and facilitate our success?
Yes, I do think it's a misconception that many people have that marriage is going to be an obstacle to flourishing in many ways in life, including professionally. And what we do see is that 20-somethings who are married, both men and women, for instance, are markedly happier than their 20-something peers who are not married. They're less depressed. Of course, they abuse substances less than their peers as well. So yeah, I would definitely like to sort of rethink this idea. You have to wait until you're 30 or 28 to really get serious about dating with an eye towards marriage, and then also to kind of not assume that the 20s are a period just to be focused on oftentimes education, work, and having a good time. Kind of just enjoying yourself when you've got free time. So, but I think there is kind of this view that the contemporary economy requires so much of us when it comes to both education and those initial career investments that we couldn't even begin to think about, trying to put, marriage and a family into the mix in your 20s as well. And I think, when I look at my own life, I got married at age 24, and I look at the lives of other peers of mine who got married in their 20s as well. There's no question that you can combine work and family in your 20s as well. You don't have to wait until, again, you're about 30 to put a ring on it.
Well, is there a correlation between a reluctance to commit to a marriage and a reluctance to participate in other kinds of community type commitments? Or is marriage treated differently? Is the more general trend sort of an individualism, or I think you mentioned this idea of limbic capitalism? Sure. Are we willing to commit to our companies and our universities and our sports teams, and it's only marriage where we've seen this deferral of commitment?
Well, I do think there's been a kind of, and this has been kind of in our circles since Robert Putnam's article and then book on bowling alone, that we've seen kind of a decline in important dimensions of both religious and secular forms of civic engagement. We're certainly living in a more individualistic society in recent decades, and that's part and parcel of why people, I think, are either taking longer to get married or they're even less likely to get married, in the first place. But I also think, too, we've seen in Pew like a change in decades where people used to basically invest marriage with more normative and sort of psychological importance, in earlier iterations of Pew polling. And today they tend to kind of basically allocate a lot more, investments or attention or significance into work especially. So I think there's just a way in which, particularly and to be clear, for really more better educated Americans, in the top third or top half of the sort of broader distribution when it comes to education, for instance, I think there's kind of this implicit assumption that what really matters is one's career, and that once you've gotten that well in hand, you kind of can turn your attention to finding a mate. And yet we see for people across, the board that generally speaking, kind of, getting married, being a good spouse, being a good parent, end up for most of us being a lot more important predictors of our happiness and meaning than, the degree on our wall or the kind of job that we handle.
Mm-hmm. Now, is part of the, I guess, cause of this phenomenon the goal of a kind of romantic or erotic partnership as opposed to something that's more pragmatic? I mean, is this romantic ideal in part?
So yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, I talk about the soulmate myth in the book, and I do think part of the reason why people are often kind of postponing marriage, or they're not kind of going with someone who's in their immediate social world, is because, and this is kind of a paradox, they in some ways have too high a view of marriage in some dimensions. I think that they're, and this is more true more for women than for men, but I think there's kind of like this desire to kind of find a soulmate, someone who kind of fits you perfectly, at least, almost perfectly, who kind of like, there's this kind of deep connection, running most of the time, and there's this emotional, romantic, attraction. The butterflies in the stomach is sort of how I talk about it for, more popular audiences. And not a recognition as much that, marriage is about romance, of course, and it should be, in part, but it's also about financial security. It's about having someone there for you when you're, 75 and heading to the oncologist to handle your cancer diagnosis and surgery. It's about, being there for any kids that you want to have and raise, together. So I talk about kind of a family first model of marriage in the book. And the idea there, again, is that marriage, yes, it's about romance, but it's also about money, support, kids, and kin. And if you have kind of this broader view of marriage, I think you're more likely to prioritize getting married in your 20s, for instance. And then later in life, I would argue, be more successfully married, because you don't have a view of marriage that's too focused on just the ebb and flow of those romantic or emotional feelings.
Yeah, you didn't talk about it in the book, but a large part of the world uses arranged marriages, right? And from what I've seen, the arranged marriages don't seem to be any less successful, or I think they result in divorce at a lower rate, although there's all sorts of other cultural confounds, I'm sure, that are at work there. But that seems kind of strange. I mean, why would arranged marriages work? I mean, should we bring this back? It's, these dating services where you sign up and they just go find somebody for you and say, "Oh, look, trust us here. Go marry this person."
Well, that's a good way. I think part of the issue with obviously arranged marriages, Greg, is that there's also kind of just much stronger kinship orientation in many of those societies. And so things are kind of, life is guided not just by, the nuclear family in a sense, but by the kind of extended family. And there are pluses and minuses there. And of course, Joseph Heinrich's work at Harvard talks about kind of how the West and our unique approach to a lot of life has been driven by a more, nuclear-oriented approach to marriage and family. that facilitate a certain kind of individualism, in Europe for many centuries. So I think we shouldn't dispense with kind of having people make a kind of voluntary move into marriage. But I do think one piece of wisdom to take from arranged marriages and from the broader kinship orientation you find in a place like India, for instance, which, as you note, tends to have reasonably happy and stably married, marriages and families. In fact, there's no more stable marriage pattern in the United States than the folks who are coming from India as immigrants. So they have the most stable marriages in America. So that's to your point. But what I would say is that for kind of native-born Americans, what I would encourage them to do when they're kind of looking to find a spouse is to be more attentive to kind of the signals that they're getting from family and friends, people that they trust. And so if your mom is kind of sending you the signal and you think that she's generally a wise woman, that this person isn't great for you, or your best friend, is doing that. And again, you think your best friend is pretty good judgment in general, and I think you need to pay attention to that, because I think often in the first blush of a romantic or erotic connection with someone, we're not very level-headed. And so as we kind of begin to get more serious or think about getting more serious about someone, I think we should be paying attention to how our friends and our family members kind of, react to our boyfriend or girlfriend or potential, boyfriend or girlfriend to make a better decision about our future.
So part of it is selection and part of it is treatment, right? So part of it is that your family and friends might know better what's good for you than you might, but then also on the other hand, you have this deeper support network, and I guess to the extent that you don't put so much demand on your spouse. I mean, I think in the romantic ideal in America is that your spouse is your best friend, your spouse is your support, your spouse is your romantic partner, and I guess if you lean less on them and lean more on your extended family and community, then you're more likely to, you're less likely to have unmet expectations.
Exactly, and that's a great point. I think one of the key challenges for contemporary couples is to not rely, on their spouse for, all of their social support and all of their emotional, connections, and to recognize that oftentimes a good girlfriend, a mother, a brother, a guy, friend is going to be a better place to turn than your spouse, and not kind of putting all of your emotional eggs in the marital basket, paradoxically tends to make your marriage more resilient rather than less important.
Well, I think you pointed to some evidence that people who are able to manage conflict within their marriage are generally also more successful and happier and even wealthier. I mean, is there a way in which your ability to manage conflict within the marriage helps you to manage conflict elsewhere? I mean, is there a correlation between the two? Is marriage sort of a testing ground, a place that shapes your capacity to navigate social relationships?
That's a great question. I mean, I think one of the sort of challenges that's made to me, when it comes to my argument that marriage is so important for adults, both women and men, is that, well, just the kinds of people who already have, social skills, various other, endowments or talents, are also the kinds of people who just end up getting married and staying married. That marriage per se isn't that important. But I would certainly argue that's part, the selection effect is part of the story, yes, but that having the counsel of a spouse, having the perspective of a spouse as you navigate both work and social challenges of one sort or another has been invaluable for me personally, and I think for a lot of people. And we do see when it comes to men, for instance, that guys who are married earn markedly more and make more strategic choices professionally than their peers who aren't married, even controlling for things like race and education and profession and age. So I do think that there are ways in which kind of being married often endows us with extra benefits, including the counsel and support of our spouse as we navigate life.
So in my professional life, I spend time teaching theory of the firm. And so in that domain, right, there's this big divide between the people who see a firm as a kind of contractual entity, individuals getting together and signing a contract versus this notion that it's a distinct kind of newly created entity. I mean, it seems when it comes to marriage, those are also two different views, right? One where it's two individuals getting together and, it's all about convenience and contingency. And, when the contract doesn't work out, you sever the contract, versus this idea that there's this entity that is almost independent of the individuals. Do those different kind of views of marriage impact the health of the marriage?
Yeah, completely is my argument in the book. I argue that there's kind of a we before me approach that's, kind of tracking how a lot of couples think about their marriage. And then there's kind of a me first approach that's indicating how a lot of other, individuals are thinking about their marriage. And one example that I give in the book is kind of talking about the merits and demerits of having joint accounts versus separate accounts.
Yeah.
And what we see in the data there is that Americans who have kind of a more we first approach to money are more likely to be flourishing in their marriages. So I find, for instance, that about 80% of couples who pool their income are very happy in their marriages, compared to just 67% of couples who don't pool their money. And so I think, I would argue that, thinking about your marriage is kind of almost, or family as a sort of separate entity apart from since your welfare and even your spouse's welfare can be really helpful, and recognize there's something larger than yourself that's governing and guiding your life. And we even, for skeptics though about this point, we even have new experimental evidence from Indiana where some psychologists randomly assigned newly married couples to joint accounts and then separate accounts. And what they found was that couples who were randomly assigned to joint accounts did markedly better in the first 2 years of marriage. They experienced less of a decline. There's basically most couples see a bit of a decline in marriage, in their marital quality in the first 2 years, but that decline was markedly lower for couples who randomly assigned joint accounts, because I think it kind of fostered in part this we before me approach, this sense that there's something larger governing, guiding your romantic and family life. So yeah, I would definitely say that Americans who have a more family first approach to marriage are more likely to be flourishing in their marriages.
Well, wait, now is this a whole new field of research, doing RCTs on newly married people? I mean,
that's a good question. This is just one study from a psychologist in Indiana, but yeah, well, you could raise questions about this, but but that's what they found. Yep.
And so you mentioned that there are sort of these four categories of people in America who are more likely to get and stay married, and of course a big part of this is religious people, right? So you highlight how religious people are among the people that have not only strong marital behaviors but also strong marital beliefs. And then you mentioned the others, and I think with conservatives and Asians, I think there's also those things line up. But with the fourth group, these strivers, I mean, the strivers are kind of the folks that have these strong marriages, but it doesn't seem to be reflected in their expressed beliefs. In other words, their revealed preferences are in conflict with their stated preferences.
So yeah, So I argue that there are four groups: religious, conservative, Asian American, and the strivers are college-educated Americans who are more likely to be flourishing. And yes, I think for many strivers who are more on the left end of the kind of political spectrum, they're often, kind of talking left but walking right when it comes to their own marriage and families. And there's kind of like an implicit, I think, appreciation for marriage and its value, but not necessarily an explicit one. And I think that they've been able to navigate that reasonably well in recent years. But I do wonder about their children, as they move into adulthood. And I was talking to a prominent Washington editor a while back, and he was kind of commenting how in his kid's very progressive DC private school, he said, like, if you have 500 kids, you've got 1,000 parents there for, the big events, kind of signaling that most of these families are two-parent married families. And yet they would never kind of publicly celebrate marriage. And so the question I have is, as you think about the younger generation, who is often more progressive on a lot of these questions and issues, especially the younger girls in the rising generation, or younger women, you just wonder if their kind of more laissez-faire, or even kind of embrace of family diversity, may end up undercutting their interest in and willingness to kind of turn towards marriage in their 20s or early 30s and form a family in that way.
Well, and so you point out that the marriage is in biggest trouble among poor people.
Correct.
But why is that? I mean, one would think that, it's not because they're the most progressive. It's not because they have sort of an ideology that is getting in the way. I mean, a lot of people would say that it's the poverty that's getting in the way. I mean, are there policies that we put in place that actually deter marriage?
So I think that it's a complicated question in the sense that there's a lot of different answers that I could sort of touch on. But I think part of the challenge here, Greg, is that we do see kind of really since the late 1960s, effectively a penalty that's accorded to marriage for lower income couples with kids, where it often makes more sense for them to just, either cohabit or do something else and get access to, it was cash welfare back in the day, now it's something like Medicaid. And I talked to, even in the last year, kind of informally, a bunch of couples who were cohabiting with some small kids, and they were doing so because mom and dad were making modest, amounts of money, but they didn't have access to health care in their place of employment. And mom was on Medicaid covering both herself and the kids. And, I was at a restaurant, for instance, in Charlottesville, and I was talking about marriage, and afterward the waitress came up to me and was asking about this. And so it came out that her partner was a cook at that very restaurant. And they had 2 kids together. They weren't married, but would like to be married, but she was on Medicaid both for herself and for the 2 kids. So that's an example of where, unfortunately, our public policies often penalize marriage for more lower income, especially working class couples today. So that's one, I think, part of the story. But I think another big part of the story here is that as you go down the income ladder, you find that there are fewer stably employed, full-time employed men. And even in 2024, Greg, I will tell you that women, even women who are more progressive-minded, prefer to date, mate, and marry and have kids with guys, but especially marry guys who are employed on a full-time basis. And so there's just less of that happening in working class and poor communities these days for a variety of reasons. And that's another, I think, big reason why you do see this class gradient in marriage, where we don't have as many kind of reliable male breadwinners in working class and poor communities, and that then is, a big drag on marriage too.
Well, are there policies that we could put in place? I think it would be very difficult for the government to mandate, employers not fire people,
sure.
Right? So forth.
Right.
That's going to be tough, right?
So I think, So in terms of the marriage penalty, we could basically increase the threshold for a lot of our means-tested programs to be double that for married versus single parents. And to kind of keep the cost down, I would recommend just limiting that kind of big threshold shift to parents with kids under the age of 6. So it's sort of they can get started as a family, get married, not lose access to Medicaid, EITC, food stamps, all that stuff. But then as they get more established, you'd have that threshold kind of come down. And I think by then too often they'd be more established financially. So that's one answer to your question. I think when it comes to kind of the male marriageability challenge facing a lot of working class and poor young men, I think we've got to go to kind of reform our schools to make them more boy-friendly and also more friendly towards a vocational track, so that they can kind of get on a track where they're not going to move into a food service job, working for Panera's or, whatever it might be, and instead kind of get the skills to be, a plumber, an IT guy, or HVAC, whatever. A lot of these more middle skill jobs, Greg, where you're earning a decent salary and you have like a real strong, I think, professional future ahead of you that makes you not just earn more money, but also think of yourself as a guy with a real important job that boosts your sense of self-confidence and also your marriageability. The other piece, and there's more we could say, I would also sort of say we need to do more to talk about what does it mean to be a man, and kind of re-engage the masculinity question. It's not going to go back to a 50s model, but something that's going to kind of latch on to young men's imaginations and hearts and minds to encourage them to be more intentional. And then finally, we've got to think about the challenge of gaming for our teenage boys and young men. There are many, I think young men are their lives are derailed by, Xbox and the like. And that's also, I think, more of a challenge for young men in the working class and poor parts of our society. So, but the bigger point I'm making is we have to think about both policies and kind of cultural shifts that would kind of make young men be more likely to flourish and become more attractive as potential husbands.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering if that's endogenous, right? So, I mean, labor instability and lack of marriageability. I mean, it must be in part due to a lack of desire to become marriageable, right? I mean, because there are certain communities where the poor people marriage rates have not declined, right? Like with Asians and so forth. So, is it that the men and boys they want to be marriageable but they can't because of economic forces, or is it because they don't really value it and so they don't see any real reason why they should adopt this type of life that would make them more attractive?
Right. So as a sociologist, I think about this as kind of like both a question in terms of socialization, but also as a Westerner, I think about this in terms of as a free will issue as well, right? And so I do think part of the challenge here, Greg, is we're not kind of equipping young men in many communities to understand and appreciate that they're going to be more likely to flourish as husbands and fathers. And if they would like to be husbands and fathers, they need to be preparing for some kind of professional, vocational future. And that means spending enough time in your high school homework and getting on some kind of, and I don't think most people have to go to college, but they have to get, I think, some kind of skill that's going to make them valuable in the contemporary economy. And so part of it is, again, like stressing the importance of marriage and family, but also kind of equipping people with tracks that recognize these multiple skills. But then also trying to the technology challenge facing our society, facing all of us, obviously personally, is just enormous in terms of what I call, electronic opiates. Like there's just the temptation to spend so much time on phones and other devices, including gaming platforms, that can really undercut our capacity to thrive. And I just think a lot of young men are falling prey to the, the electronically driven temptations of Microsoft and other, big companies that want them to, waste their time and money on their devices in ways that end up hurting their capacities to flourish in general and also in marriage in particular.
But I mean, is it in part due to a different vision of what constitutes flourishing? I mean, you talked about this guy, Andrew Tate, right? And you said there's a whole, among young people, young males, there's this whole alternative vision of what it means to flourish, which does not involve marriage. I mean, and I guess that's normally associated with the political right. So I mean, do we have folks on the political right who are sort of, joining their fellows on the left in disparaging the married life?
Yeah, so we have, I talk in my book about how on the left, you can point to any number of articles in Bloomberg and New York Times and The Atlantic that kind of disparage marriage, that, say things like, married motherhood is a game no one wins. There's a New York Times article that said that recently. But now on the right, the red pill right, people like Andrew Tate and Pearl Davis are kind of telling us that marriage, in Pearl Davis's terms, is a death sentence. Because she thinks that marriage leads to divorce and divorce leads to suicide, or Andrew Tate says that marriage has zero statistical advantage in his words, because again they think that marriage often leads to divorce and then leaves men high and dry both financially and otherwise. So different parts of the ideological landscape encouraging from the left women not to get married and from the right men not get married, and that's part of I think why marriage is down. And I'm hoping that my book and the work of others too is like Melissa Kearney, whom you've already interviewed, is helpful in getting people to realize that for the average woman and the average man, and certainly the average child, there's no question that being, part of a married family is a net plus. Yes, it's challenging and difficult for many of us to be husbands and wives and parents any number of times in our lives, but overall, we're more likely to be flourishing when we're part of a married family.
Now, it's hard to disentangle this discussion of marriage from that of traditional gender roles. And I think a lot of people who are critical of this marriage normativity are folks who are also critical of traditional gender roles. I mean, is there a relationship there? I mean, are marriages that adhere to more traditional gender roles more likely to be successful or lead to happiness or flourishing or wealth than ones that are more egalitarian?
That's a great question. And so it's in a chapter on gender in the book, I kind of try to do my best to kind of give people a sense of the current state of play when it comes to the evidence. I think for women, what I see is not a very strong association between the division of sort of, paid labor and sort of her happiness and her perceived stability when it comes to marriage. But for his kind of role, I do see that for married moms, having a husband who's employed full time is still very predictive of being more happily married and also more stably married. And that kind of when men, like for instance, lose their jobs, we see that their increased risk of divorce goes up markedly, 33% according to one Harvard study. When women lose their jobs, there's no effect on the stability of their marriage. So, and then also we see too, the division of sort of housework is really, and that's the connection with marital happiness really depends on the ideology of the wife. If she's right-leaning, she's going to be happy often with some kind of more traditional division of labor. If she's left-leaning, she's not going to be. But what's interesting is kind of across the spectrum for both left and right-leaning women, they're still markedly happy when their husbands are really engaged with their kids, if they have kids in the household. So I kind of conclude that for a lot of folks, a kind of broadly new traditional family is linked to better outcomes where however they kind of work things with mom working, dad is employed full time, and then also where dad is expected to really be plugging in with the kids on the home front, and weekends and all that kind of stuff. Then when it comes to kind of the division of housework and paid work, I think it really depends upon your ideological position. If you're left-leaning, you're going to have to, be a lot more, I think, flexible and creative. And if you're right-leaning, then you can kind of hit more of a neo-traditional clear division of labor, and that I think depends a lot on the couple, but especially on the wife's, perspective on work and family.
Well, certainly in the circles that I run in, and maybe to a lesser degree where you are in Virginia, I mean, domestic work is not seen as real work. I mean, it's I just read a recent discussion about how things were better in communist East Germany because you had higher female labor participation rates. And I thought, wait, not having to work seems like a good thing rather than a bad thing. How did we get to this point where we think that the only legitimate work is work that you do outside of the household for a paycheck? Participating in the capitalist economy is what leads to flourishing as opposed to taking care of a family and a household. Is that, I mean, as a sociologist, where did that come from? Is it because we don't want to, it's because we have some aspiration about gender equality that can only be realized through higher female labor participation rates?
Yeah, so I think part of the challenge here is that, many Americans, particularly younger Americans, subscribe to kind of a 50-50 model of gender equality, and they kind of assume that the best way to do things is to kind of split things right down the middle. So that's certainly, I think, one factor in all of this. I think the other thing that's also kind of running through all this is just kind of an implicit or explicit assumption that paid work is more valuable than the work that gets done in the home. And this is true, obviously, even in conservative households. You can have, grandfathers fathers, for instance, asking their granddaughters about their professional accomplishments, that, or professional plans, and in ways that kind of discount oftentimes the sacrifices their own wives have made. I've certainly seen this play out, in my social world, right? So I think the challenge is to sort of understand and appreciate that the work that gets done in the home often is of greater value than the work that gets done out of the home, and that we're all pretty much replaceable in our place of work. But if you're a decent husband, wife, mother, father to your spouse and to your children and then your grandkids, whatever, you're irreplaceable. And so I think if we did a better job of kind of appreciating, talking up the work of the home, there'd be a greater recognition that you needn't kind of be working full-time outside the home to have the best possible life.
So, have we overcorrected on this? Certainly, 30, 40 years ago, I think it was necessary for parents to tell their daughters, let's say, hey, you can be an astronaut, you can be a CEO. But have we gotten to the point where by saying, you can be this, we're now implying that you have to be this, or you ought to be this? Is there a way to be non-judgmental and say it's perfectly okay to be outside of the paid workforce, and that no one's going to judge you negatively for that?
Yeah, I think it is, and I think it's also important to sort of give and recognize that not all women are the same, but there's certainly a large share of new mothers, even new mothers who kind of intended to work full time after they had the baby, who kind of come to a point when they bring home the baby from the hospital, for instance, when they're just thinking about I would like to be at home for a time, or I'd like to work part-time for a time. And just to be kind of more honest with them and our families in general, and I'm saying that's a perfectly natural response. And let's try to figure out a world where it's easier, like with, for instance, more generous child tax credits, to make that model of family life financially feasible as well.
Well, I think one of the more popular policy proposals involves daycare, making daycare more available. How can one object to that? Is there a potential problem with encouraging daycare? I know some folks who they'll work and almost the entirety of their paycheck gets turned around to pay someone else to do daycare. And for GDP statistics, it's fantastic because now you have two paychecks instead of zero. But is that necessarily good for all the parties involved? Should we be less obsessed with daycare as a policy?
I think it's important to note on the daycare question that there's a real big class divide on the daycare issue. So well-educated American parents are way more kind of favorable in their thinking towards childcare. It could be a daycare, it could be a au pair, whatever. Whereas working class Americans, middle class Americans are more likely to think it's better to have usually mom, but a parent or a grandparent, take the lead when it comes to caring for young kids. So I think just recognize there's a pluralistic kind of position on that in terms of the public mind. But then when it comes to kind of like the research on babies and toddlers, and this is obviously a question of, there's a lot of debate about this, but I think putting a baby in extensive non-maternal care is certainly linked to some negative social and emotional outcomes, for that child on average. And, it's not like every kid who goes to daycare is going to be, hurt. Most kids don't seem to be hurt, but there's certainly an elevated risk for social and emotional problems for young children and babies who spend a lot of time in non-maternal care. And so I think given that, we should be, again, telling people it's fine for mom to stay home, it's time mom to work part-time when you've got young children, and doing more to kind of push what I would stress is kind of like the child tax credit option, where you kind of give families a bucket of money, if you will, and let them kind of figure out how best to spend it. Some are going to use it on daycare, and some are going to use it on having a parent at home, and some are going to use it to kind of have grandma look after the kids. But I do think, given the research on both polling when it comes to daycare and then also when it comes to the welfare of particularly infants, that we should be open to a more flexible approach that allows for families to spend money on having either a parent or grandparent, at home for a substantial period of a young child's life.
Now I'm curious. I mean, you're in sociology. I think I was reading statistics around political orientation in various disciplines, and I think sociology was among the ones that was the most I guess skewed in the direction.
Right. So we do see that my discipline is markedly more progressive, than other disciplines, and so the kind of perspective I'm articulating today is certainly out of the norm. But if you look kind of back in the deeper sociological tradition, you see figures like Robert Nisbet, and even farther back figures like Émile Durkheim, the great French sociologist, who would be, articulating ideas about family and community, and religion that would be kind of congruent with the perspective that I've articulated in a lot of my own, research and writing.
And so, look, what do you think needs to be done to strengthen marriages in general? I mean, do you think the best approach is to try to help educated elite people to realize how privileged they are in having successful marriages? Perhaps help them to become more aware of the divergence between their stated and revealed preferences? I mean, is that the best place to start?
So I think that's certainly part of the answer is we have to help our elites understand that, marriage benefits not just them, but people in general. And so insofar as they're kind of school superintendents, professors, journalists, C-suite executives, they could be taking steps, in Hollywood, at Netflix, heading up a school district's approach to relationship education, a New York Times journalist, to just do a better job of kind of, and I'm not even asking for like a rose-colored take on marriage, just like truthful take, so that our ordinary kids out there who are watching a Netflix show or exposed often indirectly to some kind of major media coverage, just come to appreciate more how much marriage matters for them and for any kids that they have down the road. That would be, I think, part of the answer. But we've also got to recognize and realize that there's a financial piece to all this, and that's why addressing things like the marriage penalty and kind of also giving people a more generous child tax credit would be helpful as well. So yes, part of the challenge is kind of getting elites to kind of preach in public what they practice in private, in their kind of institutional or professional capacities, but also kind of rearranging some of the economic incentives to be more marriage and family friendly for ordinary folks as well.
So it is about, I mean, I think to their credit, our elites, I mean, we think about inequality, right? We think about it a lot. We worry about it a lot. I mean, it's not clear whether we're doing anything about it, but I mean, should we be thinking about marriage inequality? Should we think that, hey, this is something that, elite people are disproportionately beneficiaries of, and really think about it in terms of, unequal access to this, I guess, social capital that comes from marriage?
Yeah, so I think that we should be encouraging elites to think about the way in which there is this sort of marriage inequality, and to think about roles that they could take to kind of minimize this inequality. And so, as I said, if you're a journalist, tell the truth about marriage. If you're a school superintendent, think about how you train your kids in terms of relationship education, and just even marriage facts would be helpful too for our societies. Is my argument, definitely.
And would we need to somehow separate the support for marriage from these other things that are normally associated with conservatism, like religion and so forth? I mean, it seems like as long as marriage is seen as something which is, religious, it's going to be very difficult to get a big chunk of society behind it. Even though it's clear that there is a strong relationship, is it necessary to, rebrand marriage as a liberal institution to get it to, garner more support?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I do think it'd be helpful to kind of to sort of take it away from the realm of religion and politics if possible. And and frankly, I mean, I'm a Catholic conservative guy, so I don't. That's not going to be my job, and I'm honest about that. But there's certainly people like you've spoken to, Melissa Kearney, who's not a not a conservative, and we need more voices like hers to kind of reach I think folks especially on the left, and help them understand and appreciate how much marriage benefits, generally speaking, women and men who lean left. And there was for many decades when this wasn't really a partisan issue, wasn't a religious issue, and we're not going to go back to again a 1955 model, but I think we could go forward to a model where there'd be somewhat different forms of marriage and family life articulated in people's lived experience, but where the left would be better about acknowledging and even celebrating the way in which marriage can ground and guide a good progressive family life as well.
Well, Brad, thanks so much for joining me. New book is called Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. And it's not just a sociological study, but it also comes with some helpful advice, right, for people who are interested in or who are already married. Thanks so much, Brad.
Okay, thanks, Greg. I appreciate it.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.